Hello everybody and welcome back to another video here. Today we're going to be ranking the Rome Total War factions from best to worst here basically, and a little tier maker we got. And this has the Rome Total War factions. It doesn't have people like the Rebels, but it has basically everyone you care about other than them. And the reason I'm doing Rome Total War in this type of video is, as you saw in my last video, it was a Total War related video. I do like the Total War franchise a lot, and in particular, I think Rome Total War is probably the best game, and it's by far my favorite game. It's probably the one I've put the most amount of hours into of all of the games in the franchise. So I really like the game and talking about it, playing it, and I just figured I would put like a little video out there of my opinion on the strongest and weakest factions of Rome Total War. Now, keep in mind this is without any mods or deals or like I don't know how the remastered changed this at all, but this is the base game. No mods, no remaster. This is just base face value factions, how strong or weak they are, in my opinion. And yeah, let's get it going here. Armenia, we got first here. I'd say it probably, and I haven't looked at like every metric or whatever. And by the way, what I'm talking about here is basically the campaign sense. I'm not talking about the multiplayer battle. I will take into consideration the army and how good it is, but I'm going to be mainly considering how good they are in a campaign sense. How easy their campaign is, how good of a position they're in, how good their economy and armies are, you know, all that stuff. That's what I'm not taking into consideration as much multiplayer battles and their army only. It's basically the entire campaign as a whole. So Armenia probably for me would be a D or a C. Um, I'll put them at a D just because they're not a great faction to play as, and they're not that fun either. But just at a like power level, um, they're not in a great position starting. Their cities are rather spread out, which makes moving troops and armies between the cities rather problematic. They're not in an incredibly defensible position. They've got a lot of bordering countries surrounding them that could potentially be allies, but a lot of them could also be potential enemies, like Parthia, Scythia, Pontus. Countries or factions that are arguably more powerful, at least militarily, to Armenia are on your border and could potentially be opponents that you'd have to deal with rather early on in the game. As far as where you are in the map, like in an economical situation, it could be worse, but it could be a lot better. You're not in a great economic situation. That's where you start. You can expand in the good, like if you expand south into Egypt, into Turkey and Greece, that's obviously a very rich, economically sound region. But as for where you start, it's not the greatest. And your economy isn't exactly the strongest in the game. Uh, as far as as far as your army goes, it's not one of the more impressive lineups in the game. I'd say it is rather weak compared to a lot of nations. For where you are in the world, your cavalry seems kind of subpar when considering a lot of other nations around you, like Parthia, who probably has better heavy and shot cav than you, and Scythia, who has better horse archers than you do. You're kind of outclassed cavalry wise, basically everywhere you turn. Uh, as far as the regular army, infantry wise, yeah, you're not the better. You're not the best either. You've got Pontus near you, which has a much better army than you because they have access to a better lineup of troops overall, as well as even above that, they're just a better faction and where they're positioned. Um, you've got yeah, you've got you're surrounded by people who militarily are in a better position than you. Yes, you're playing against potentially AI opponents here, so you can kind of work around that. But if that were what I'd be grading this off of, then everyone could be S tier because you can win a campaign as basically any one of these nations. But Armenia is not a very strong faction, and yeah, that's why they're in the D category. Next up, we got Britain. I put these in the C category. I think they are better than Armenia, but I don't think they're that good of a faction overall. I think your economy is weak per where you are on the map. You know, the barbarian northern realms aren't a very prosperous or rich region. Uh, so that's going to hurt you. Your cities and your economy aren't great. You won't have massive, very prosperous, rich cities or cities that produce a lot of denarii or produce a lot of income for you. And it's going to be problematic when maintaining your cities and your army and building armies that your economy kind of sucks. Your position or your military as Britain, yes, they're worse, but your military is not that good. It's kind of unique and it's kind of fun to play as, but it's not that good. I think your infantry is adequate at best, you know, able to at least match the opponents around you, unless it's Rome, who's expanded. I don't think their cavalry is very good. The chariots that they really are big on are not very good, especially later in the game. They are probably one of my least favorite to play. I just don't like playing with chariots. They're very difficult to keep alive and control, and they're not that numerous. So your infantry is average at best. You have a probably subpar, especially later in the game, cavalry, and yeah, your archers and long range stuff is whatever. It's adequate at best as well. Military wise, you're probably not one of the stronger factions. As far as where you start on the map, that's probably one of their kind of strengths. It's kind of a double edged sword because, yes, for where you start on the map in Britain and also Northern Gaul, it is a very defensible position, but at the same time, that's probably one of the only pros that they have going for them over other nations. Is you start in a very defensible position, with Britain being an island, you having armies there, being tucked in the corner of the map. You have one opponent in Ireland, the rebels, but that city is incredibly easy to take, and you can take it very early. Not a great city though, by the way. So unfortunately, don't get a very good city out of it. Very defensible position though. Uh, outside of the city you have on Gaul is less defensible, but even then, it's still to the northmost of Gaul. But you still do have an enemy city on three sides, basically. Um, so yeah, defensible position, but your position is also very poor, and you are surrounded by Gaul and Germany. Now, Germany economically is pretty bad as well, but their army, in my opinion, is a lot more fun for one, but is a lot better than yours is. And not only that, but they also have a lot more cities and a lot more room to expand than you do out of the bat. Yeah, they're in the middle, so they're not as defensible, but they can expand faster than you can and in more directions. And they usually do. And then you have Gaul, which isn't a big threat, especially when it's being attacked by probably Germany, Rome, maybe Spain. You know, they've got a lot to deal with, and they're not a particularly strong faction of their own. So you've got an okay starting position, actually, especially if you can befriend Germany. If you can get trade rights, you know, in an alliance and everything with Germany, you're in a pretty good position. You can mostly take over Gaul and maybe even a little to Spain before you beat the Romans. And hopefully you have a decent enough position and foothold to at least hold on, or at least, you know, go toe to toe with Julia, and hopefully win that conflict, or go toe to toe with the Germans and maybe win that conflict. So, next is Carthage here. Carthage is, I'd say, probably B tier. I know a lot of people think they're really strong, but they're like a B or an A for me. I'm thinking about moving into A. They'll probably be A, just because I refrain from putting them high on the A tier or the S tier, especially because your economy is fine, your army is okay. It's just your starting position is very, very, how do I put this? Like, very advantageous to you losing a lot of cities if you're not careful, and also they're very spread out. This is not a very close knit empire. You've got a city in Spain, North Africa, you've got Sicily, you've got whatever those other two islands in the Mediterranean are. You've got a very spread out, kind of fractured empire here that is problematic to move troops through and muster the entire strength of the empire when it's so spread out. Not only that, but you have Rome to deal with right off the bat, and the Scipii and the Julii, who usually come after one of your cities. So you've got two factions of Rome that are already immediately trying to attack you most games. You've also got the Greek city-states who might pose a problem and might not, if they depending on who takes them, you or the Scipii. You know, depending on that. You've got very difficult enemies basically surrounding you, and your position is not a very strong one. You've got a decent economy, which is one of the pros going for Carthage. Is your economy and your cities are actually fairly solid for the most part, especially where you can expand to, potentially like Italy, Egypt, Spain even. Definitely rather rich areas of the map you can expand into, and more powerful positions of the map. So that's also good for you. But the main knock is your military and who you're fighting at the start of the game. Now, you could argue that fighting Rome at the start of the game is, in some ways, kind of a pro, because you can get them before they've really expanded past, their initial starting area, and, really grown in power and wealth and everything. But your army really isn't that up to snuff with the Romans. Your only real advantage over them is that you have war elephants. That's your really only, trick card that you can pull on them. And even then, those can be problematic to control. So it's kind of an iffy situation there. As far as your infantry goes, it's adequate enough at best. It's usually going to be outclassed by whatever Roman army you were attacking. The Hastati at the start of the game that the Romans will probably be fighting you with are better than your Iberian infantry, or whatever they're called. They are outclassed by the Romans in basically every category, but basically war elephants until the Romans get access to that themselves. And various mercenaries they can hire until, again, the Romans also get access to those mercenaries eventually. So yeah, it's a very high stakes starting positions. If you are successful in your war against Rome, you can obviously have a very successful, prosperous, campaign and empire, but it makes it so you have the potential to be a very powerful empire and all of that, and you have a decent starting position with a decent economy and an okay army. It's just the fact that where you start is probably one of the harder positions in the game because you're going up against enemies that are arguably the hardest enemies to go up in the entire game right off the bat. So, on all directions, basically. So, yeah, that's the huge knock against Carthage I have. Also, yeah, I like Rome more, so I don't particularly care for Carthage. You got Dacia here. Probably a B or probably a C or a D category. I'll put them in D. Dacia, again, not a great starting position. You are surrounded on all sides by armies that are much better than yours. The Scythians and their horse archers, the Germans and their superior army lineup, particularly in infantry. To your south, you've got the Greek city-states Macedon and Thrace, and eventually the Romans as well, which are some of the hardest opponents to go up against in the entire game, especially if you're trying to expand into those zones. Your economy, for one, is very bad. Probably one of the worst in the game. Your cities aren't that spread out, and it's kind of it's not fractured. It's all, united empire. But where your cities are and how prosperous they are leave a lot to be desired. They're very poor, not very good economically. Your army's not good, especially compared to everybody around you, basically. Very tough starting position, not a good economy, not that good of an army. Very weak faction overall. Very hard campaign as well. Next we got Egypt. I think Egypt, beside the Romes, who we'll get to later, is probably one of the only S tier outside of Rome that I even consider. Egypt, you've got a lot going for you. You've got a very solid army roster. You've got the capabilities not only to have a very good roster of armies and units, but be able to field a lot of armies and units because you have a very wealthy starting position that can get even wealthier depending on where you try to expand, either into Turkey and then Greece, or into North Africa, and then who knows from there. So yeah, very good starting position. Very wealthy, good economy and cities, good starting position. You've got weak enemies basically on every side of your border, with the Seleucids. Parthia is kind of on your border, but not really. But if you can get to them early, they're very weak and spread out, as well as poor. You've got Numidia, who's not that big of a challenge. Yeah, so you're basically surrounded on all sides by very weak, spread out, poor opponents. And you yourself are very rich, prosperous, and powerful with a good army and a good economy. Very strong. One of the probably worst places to try to fight as the Romans, especially the Scipii and the Bruttii, facing Egypt is one of the biggest pains in the ass because generally they are very rich, they have a lot of armies, they've got a decent amount of territory. It's just a pain in the ass. Very good faction overall. Gaul here, I'll put them in C tier, maybe even D tier. Gaul has a lot of problems. I definitely put them lower than Britain, but yeah. Gaul has a lot of problems. One being their starting position is very bad. You're not a particularly rich starting position. You're kind of okay as probably one of the better barbarian factions economy-wise, especially with their northern Italy settlements, if you can hold them long enough from the Romans. But overall, as a whole, your empire isn't that prosperous economically wise. But if you can hold on to your settlements and then go into Greece and Italy, you can have access to potentially very wealthy provinces and regions. So economy-wise, it's not great, but you can do a lot worse. Army-wise, your army roster is really not that good. You've got okay infantry, especially once you get to like the Chosen Swordsmen. They've got solid infantry. I wouldn't say it's anything that could go toe to toe with the Romans, especially if it was not another player, not just an AI. Nothing better than the Romans have. Uh, I think your army, cavalry wise, doesn't really do that much to surpass Rome or any other surrounding faction. Same with archers and stuff like that. So kind of subpar, average roster, especially considering who you're surrounded by with Rome and Germany, I guess. And one of the worst parts about Gaul is your starting position and who you're surrounded by. As with Gaul, you were surrounded by a lot of very hostile factions that have, in some cases, either better armies or better economies than you, or sometimes both. You're surrounded by Spain to your kind of like west, I guess, but also kind of to your southwest there. Uh, for your northern Italy, you've obviously got the Julii to deal with, which is obviously not ideal to have Rome right on your doorsteps immediately trying to conquer you, especially when you're not really up to snuff with their army at this point in the game. To your north, you've got Britain, who's got a very defensible and annoying position to try to get them out of if they decide to attack you. Um, but you could try to take their northern Gaul province and then kind of just wall them off there. But going to be a constant nuisance from Ireland and Britain. You've got to your east, you've got Germany, who is a very strong military infantry roster and very hostile towards you. So basically, you've got a lot of people attacking you, and the people attacking you generally have more pros and more stuff going for them than you do. You're probably the weakest faction, other than maybe Spain, that's attacking you, and you're getting attacked basically on all fronts, sometimes even, and it's just, yeah, very difficult starting position to get out of. Next up is Germany. I think is an A tier. I think they're the best barbarian faction by a decent margin. Yes, your economy is very bad, just like a lot of other barbarian factions, but that's probably one of the only huge downsides to you. Yes, you start in the middle, which theoretically you can get attacked from two sides, which isn't ideal, but at the same time, there's more room to expand, and the people attacking you, or people you could potentially expand to, are military-wise weaker than you. You have a much better military roster than basically anybody you'll be facing early in the game. Very good overall. I think they have probably the best barbarian unit roster in the entire game, and they have a very fun and unique roster to play. Okay starting position, kind of a double-edged sword. Pretty poor economy, but if you expand fast enough in the rather prosperous regions, it can be kind of managed. So yeah, Germany overall, very strong faction. Can be a very fun campaign. Fairly powerful. Yeah. Next is the Greek city-states, who probably get the B for me. I think the Greek city-states have a very powerful unit roster. I think the Spartans and the hoplites and everything are very good, especially if you're defending. But the main problem with Greek city-states is you're kind of fractured. You've got settlements spread out all over the place in Rhodes, Turkey, Greece, Sicily. You're very fragmented. Your cities are rather spread out, which means that you have the potential to lose a lot of cities early on because you're spread out and you can't really manage to defend them properly. So yeah, very spread out and difficult starting position. You also have the problem with the Romans attacking you very soon. You immediately come into contact with and are usually attacked by the Scipii and the Bruttii Roman factions, which isn't obviously ideal. You've got Macedon, who you can usually handle Macedon, but on top of Uh, you can usually handle Macedon assuming they attack you and you're not an ally with them. If they do decide to attack you, though, while you could handle them on your own, when attacked by like two other Roman factions and maybe some people from Turkey or Thrace, it becomes a lot to deal with, and is very you can get overwhelmed very quickly. Uh, but yeah, you do have a decent economy. Uh, you do have a decent starting position where you are for economy wise and a good military roster though. Going more to their economy, you do have good cities, and you also start in probably the wealthiest region of the entire game, which is Greece, and have the potential to expand into places like Italy, Turkey, and Egypt that are also very wealthy. So you're in a very wealthy and rich part of the map, which yeah is always great for your economy. So that's probably one of the strongest selling points of them, as well as their unit roster, especially when defending. But it's a very tough starting position as who's attacking you, and you're very spread out city wise, very fragmented. It's not all together. It can be harder to maintain and expand from this position when you're not really united, I guess. I'd say Macedon's also in B tier, a little lower than Greek city states. Or maybe a little higher, I don't know. I think they're fairly equal. Obviously, fairly similar unit roster, but basically everything I said about Greece also applies for Macedon. You've got a tricky starting position on who can attack you, that being Rome, Greek city states, Thrace, uh, but you have a solid unit roster. You've got a good economy, and you're in a very wealthy part of the map. It's just a very hard start for who can attack you and where they can attack you from, which is basically everywhere. But potentially very powerful and very wealthy army and economy wise. So overall, fairly strong faction. Numidia, not a faction I'm very experienced with or know a lot about, but I put them in the C category, if not the D category. Very spread out starting position. Yes, you're united by borders, but your cities are very far spread out, which can be very problematic when trying to reinforce them and move troops between cities, city to city. Uh, where you start isn't exactly the most wealthy part of the map. Obviously, if you expand into places like Egypt or Italy or Carthage, even, or Greece, even, yes, very wealthy, and you can kind of get to them rather quickly. But your roster isn't very fleshed out. It's not particularly good. Your economy to start the game isn't particularly good. You're very spread out, and it takes a lot of time to move troops to other places that you want them to go. You, yeah, you're not in a great starting position. Your economy's not good. You really don't have a lot going for you other than the potential to maybe expand into wealthier, stronger positions on the map. But that means taking out entire empires that are much stronger and wealthier than you are currently, with much better militaries. So yeah, not a great faction power wise. Can even make an argument for D tier for these guys. Uh, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong and there's some exploit or something that they're really good at. But from what I understand and see, they are not a very powerful or threatening faction. Parthia. Parthia would be in the B category. Mainly because, let's go over the categories I like. Military wise, you're okay. Yes, you have by far probably the best heavy cav in the game. You know, your cataphracts and whatever are very good and very fun, but you're very one dimensional. Really, all you have going for you is cavalry. Your infantry is very bad and almost non existent. You got like 3 units of infantry, I think. Yeah, not very good there. You're very one dimensional with what you can do, or at least do well. Uh, your starting position, let's move into that, is kind of defensible in the fact that you can only be attacked from your west because you're tucked in the corner of the map. But your starting position is very spread out, very spread out. So it takes a long time to move troops between locations and reinforce potentially. So you have the potential to be have cities isolated from the empire and taken. Uh, Also, very early on, you're not that militarily powerful, and you've got people like Scythia on your border, as well as people like eventually Egypt, and even the Seleucids early on are better than you, really. So yeah, early on, especially not a great starting position. It's also a very poor starting position. Kind of segueing into the economy here. Your economy, especially at the start when you haven't really expanded, your cities are rather poor, and you're in a very poor region of the map for where you are. It takes a second to expand into a place like Egypt or Turkey or Greece that is a lot more wealthy. So you're going to be dealing with economy issues that are some of the worst in the game, which isn't ideal for maintaining the cities and maintaining and recruiting armies. So yeah, got a lot to overcome as Parthia, especially early on. But if you can, late game, you have access to some of the best and most fun cavalry to use in the game. So, there's a silver lining, which is why they're in B, basically. Pontus? I think Pontus is actually a fairly powerful civ here. Or it's not civ, but faction. Overall, Pontus is fairly good. You've got a good unit roster for where you are infantry-wise. I think you have some of the better, if not the best, infantry of people surrounding you, like the Seleucids, Armenia, people like that. You've got a good unit roster for infantry and well-rounded as a whole. You're in a pretty advantageous spot to basically take over most of, if not all of Turkey, as well as a decent amount of the rest of the Middle East, especially early on when you're probably the more dominant of the factions military and economy-wise. Yes, you're in the middle. It can potentially be attacked by like Seleucids Armenia, but they're not particularly strong factions, especially compared to you, military or economy-wise. So have the opportunity to expand rather rapidly, to take over a very good chunk of the map very quickly. With the Seleucids, you can basically take over Turkey and most of the Middle East without too much of trouble. Obviously, Egypt is going to be very difficult to go toe-to-toe with, but that's your really only challenge until eventually the Romans come knocking from Turkey. And, of course, you have another challenge. But that's later in the game. Early game, I think you're in a fairly advantageous position. And even late in the game, you should be solidified enough and rich and powerful enough to economically and military-wise be able to at least put up a fight and go toe-to-toe, if not beat the Romans that come over and try to fight with you. Next is the Bruttii faction of Rome. I think this is an S-tier faction, as most of the Rome will be. First of all, the Rome, you have access to probably the best unit roster in the military in the entire game, especially when you're considering infantry. So yeah, check that box real quick. Military, amazing. Starting position and economy, because they're kind of one and the same because of how wealthy your provinces are. Again, probably some of the best in the game. Economy-wise, and starting position as it relates to economy is very good. You expand into probably the wealthiest part of the entire map, especially compared to other Romes. You expand into places like Greece, Turkey, Egypt. Very powerful, very rich cities and regions. So you have the potential to basically be the richest faction in the game very early on because of where you're expanding and stay the richest faction in the game. The only negative I see here, as compared to other Romans especially, is that you expand into probably the hardest opponent-wise part of the map in the entire game. You face Macedon, Thrace, Greek city-states. You face people like potentially Scythia and Dacia to your north, or Scythia particularly is rather powerful with their horse archers. You face people like Pontus, you face people like Parthia, you face people like Egypt, particularly, who all are very wealthy, who are very, or some of them are very wealthy, and they're all very militarily, especially later in the game, particularly Parthia there, very militarily powerful, and have been developing while you've been getting to them. So yeah, probably the hardest as far as who you're fighting on the realms, but also expanded to the richest, most prosperous region of the game. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. The Julii here, I think they're above Egypt, but they're below Brudii in the S tier. Same reason the Brudii, very good unit roster military-wise, and very good starting position for Italy. But why I think they're probably, we'll get to this once we do the Scipio, I probably think they're the worst Roman faction is because military-wise, they're probably the weakest. They don't have the navy of the Scipii, and they don't have the money of the Brudii. You expand into, while it's not as hard to conquer, it's probably the easiest region to conquer with Gaul, people like Gaul, Spain, Britain, Dacia. Your only real challenge is Germany, really, and even they get conquered rather easily when you're playing as Julia yourself. So very easy region to conquer because it's very poor and the armies aren't really as good as yours. But because of that, you're inheriting a lot of land that is very poor. So economically speaking, you're probably going to be the weakest faction of Rome in the game, which is very bad. Your cities aren't going to be as good. You're not going to make as much money. You're not as good as part of the map. You're not really as good military-wise because you don't have as much money and you don't have as much naval power. So you're not really... You're very powerful because you're a Roman faction, but other than that, compared to the other Romes, I think you're probably the worst. So yeah, still very powerful, don't get me wrong. I know I'm kind of throwing a lot of negatives on them, but very powerful still, just probably the worst Roman faction to play as. The Scipii here, I think, are S tier as well, just behind the Brudii. Well, I think the Scipii are very powerful, and you can even make an argument for most powerful, really, is they move into a more economically favorable position than the Julii, but not the Brudii. You move into North Africa after you beat Carthage and Numidia, which is fairly good economically wise, especially the north of Africa. You have the potential to move into Spain, which is probably the best of the Julii's faction parts, where you can just kind of cut them off there. You have the potential to move into Egypt, which is obviously very powerful and rich. And from there, if you move fast, you can even be a little cheeky and try to steal some Greek or Turkish settlements from the Brudii. So yeah, potential to be very economically powerful. Your Rome's very good unit roster military-wise. And on top of that, you also have probably the most powerful navy in the game, which is a little like... Obviously, the navy isn't that important to the Rome Total War, but it's good to have. And having the best navy in the game obviously doesn't hurt. So yeah, another good for the military there. So yeah. As far as the starting position and opponents you face, it's second only to probably the Brudii in difficulty, because you go up against people like the Carthaginians, who are a rather powerful empire and annoying to deal with. You obviously are probably going to be facing Egypt at some point, which is very difficult to face again. You could potentially be facing people like the Greek city-states, or Pontus, or Parthia, if you really want to go into those parts of the map. So yeah, rather difficult opponents that you could potentially be facing. So yeah, that's why I think they're one of the harder starting positions of the Romans. But I think you're better off than the Julii because you have a more powerful navy and military, as well as you're being more economically favorable. But yeah, very good faction, very fun faction to play as. Very good Roman campaign to play as. Scythia here, I think, is an A tier faction. Scythia, while I know you're kind of tucked in the corner of the map in a very spread out and economically poor region of the map, you have the potential to expand into places like Dacia, Parthia early in the game, Armenia, and Thrace, which is probably the worst of the Greekified places. So you have a lot of weak opponents, especially early in the game, that you can potentially expand to, even if they aren't military or economically that favorable. I think the main selling point here is your army is very good. The horse archers of Scythia are overpowered as hell. You can basically win any battle with an army of horse archers, and just send them in, do damage, retreat, repeat, rinse, repeat that, and it's just a very good army that's the potential to expand very rapidly. Yes, the basically everything else is going against you. You're economically not that rich. You don't have the access to a very advantageous or rich position of the map until midway through the game. And your cities are rather spread out, so moving between cities can be annoying. But you have the potential to expand rapidly into a lot of weak enemies, get a lot of cities and territories, and you have probably one of the most powerful armies in the game. So yeah, very powerful faction. Seleucus, I say, is a D or C tier. You can make an argument for either. I would have put them at the D tier just because it is brutal playing as these guys. You've got a rather large empire in a fairly rich region of the game, which is obviously good, but the problem is you're surrounded on basically all sides by people who want to attack you and will attack you. Your empire is rather spread out and is hard to protect, and you're going to be attacked by a lot of nations who will probably take a lot of your cities. Your army, especially early on in the game, isn't particularly that strong. You're not as rich as people like Egypt attacking you, or really as militarily powerful, and you're going to be attacked from a lot of sides. You're not in a great position defensive-wise. Your army's not particularly great. Your economy's okay, but could be better. And yeah, you're going to be attacked by people like the Greek city-states, potentially. People like Armenia, Pontus, people like Egypt, Parthia. You're going to be attacked by all sides, probably lose a couple cities. Very difficult campaign to solidify your position and then expand, just because of how spread out it is and how many people are attacking you. So yeah, very weak, especially early in the game. Very threatened position on the map. So yeah, very hard campaign. Spain, I don't think is that good. C or D tier as well. The reason for that being is that Spain, not a particularly strong unit roster. Fairly small, not fleshed out, and not very powerful or good compared to a lot of surrounding people like the Romans or Carthaginians. Yes, you basically have all of Spain, other than like 2 settlements, and you can basically solidify Spain. Your cities are somewhat spread out, and it's not a very rich region of the map. Also, you have people like Numidia, Carthage, people like Gaul, Germany, and potentially Britain attacking you, as well as the Romans are going to come over at some point. It's going to be a very hard campaign, and you're going to be attacked from a lot of different sides by a lot of different nations. Your army is not particularly powerful, and you're not in a particularly rich region of the map either. But there are definitely worse campaigns. Thrace, probably a C or B tier campaign. I'll give him higher up on the C tier list, just because you're probably the weakest position-wise of a lot of like Greekified or Hellenistic or whatever you call it factions. Your unit roster is fine. It's fairly average. Not particularly strong, but not weak by any means. Your starting position isn't great though. You're probably going to be fighting people like the Greek city-states and or Macedon, who are fairly powerful and rich. You have people like Dacia next to you who aren't very good, but probably someone you also have to deal with. Rome, the Brudii are obviously going to come over and try to mess with you. You've got people like Scythia to your north who are very powerful. Maybe not the AI, but overall they've got a strong army. You've got not a particularly rich region you're starting in, and as far as places to expand, to your north, obviously it's not very rich or prosperous, but you might have to expand there because they probably try to attack you, and you got to get rid of them. Um, but to your south, obviously, you have a fairly rich region, but you're probably going to have to fight people like the Greek city-states, Macedon, and the Bruttii to actually get that, and that's very difficult and challenging, especially as an army who's not really better than any of the people you're fighting, and you're not really richer than either any of the people you're fighting either, unless you go north. And yeah, kind of just subpar, like unremarkable faction. They're okay. Definitely worse campaigns, but yeah, okay faction. Just kind of unremarkable. I don't know. I don't really care for Thrace that much either. So yeah, this was the rankings of the Rome Total War factions. Hope you guys enjoyed. If I did sound a little weird or raspy, I am feeling a little under the weather, so that's why. But I just wanted to put out this video and content. Hope you guys enjoyed. Probably do more Total War content in the future. Also might do some Elden Ring content. I picked that up a few days ago. Been playing it non-stop. Very fun, very good game. So probably do some content on that because I know everyone's playing that right now. So look for that. And yeah, if you like the video, subscribe, like, comment down below who you think are the worst and best factions in the game. And I'll see you guys later.